If the United States were to launch a major attack on Iran, Tehran's defense would not be built around defeating U.S. forces in a symmetrical set-piece war. It would be built around survival of the regime and the state, preserving the ability to retaliate and imposing costs across multiple domains: maritime, missile, air defense, cyber, and regional proxy warfare, so that Washington faces a campaign whose risk, duration, and geopolitical spillover quickly become hard to control. This approach is rooted in Iran's long experience of isolation, the legacy of the 1980-88 Iran-Iraq War, and decades of sanctions that pushed it toward asymmetric tools where it can be competitive, missiles, drones, dispersed launch forces, and deniable partners, rather than platforms where it is outmatched, modern airpower and blue water naval power. And it begins with geography. Iran sits astride the Persian Gulf's northern shore and the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz with coastlines, islands, and terrain that make it easier to hide mobile launchers, fast small craft, and short-notice mining operations than it is to protect large, fixed bases and airfields from U.S. precision strikes. In practical terms, the earliest Iranian priority in a conflict would be to keep its command structure functioning under attack, shifting to redundant communications, delegating authority to IRGC and regular military regional nodes, and dispersing high-value assets into hardened or underground facilities, because Iran's deterrent value depends less on any single silver bullet weapon and more on maintaining continuous, credible threat streams day after day, missile launches that keep regional bases under pressure, drones that keep air defenses and radars busy, maritime harassment that keeps insurers and shipping companies cautious, and cyber activity that keeps civilian confidence in critical services strained. At sea, Iran's defensive concept is commonly described as an anti-access, area denial problem designed to turn the Strait of Hormuz and nearby waters into a high-friction environment where U.S. naval forces can operate but cannot operate cheaply or casually, and where the global economic consequences of disruption become part of Iran's strategic leverage. Rather than trying to fight U.S. carrier groups ship for ship, Iran's most plausible maritime tools are layered: mines, coastal anti-ship cruise missiles, and, in some assessments, anti-ship ballistic missile concepts, fast attack craft and swarm tactics, submarines, including smaller boats suited to littoral waters, and reconnaissance strike drones that can cue attacks, attempt saturation, and force U.S. escorts to spend expensive interceptors against cheaper threats. Mining is especially important because it does not require Iran to win a naval battle to cause outsized disruption. Credible fear of mines can be enough to slow or temporarily halt traffic, spike risk premiums, and force time-consuming mine countermeasure operations while Iran tries to keep the area dangerous with missiles and drones, so even limited mining or suspected mining can become strategically meaningful. Alongside that, coastal missile batteries and mobile launchers aim to complicate U.S. freedom of maneuver, forcing ships to operate with tighter defensive formations, more restrictive emissions control, and greater dependence on layered defenses, Aegis SM interceptors, electronic warfare, point defenses, all of which can be stressed by multi-axis salvos that combine different altitudes and profiles, sea-skimming cruise missiles, one-way attack drones, and other projectiles, and are timed to exploit reaction time limits. Iran's air defenses, meanwhile, are not best understood as a single impenetrable shield. Open-source analysis repeatedly emphasizes uncertainty about real-world performance and the vulnerability of fixed radars and command nodes under sustained strike, but rather as a set of layers meant to protect key facilities, contest U.S. allied intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ISR near Iran's borders, and preserve enough mobile surface-to-air missile units to make U.S. pilots and planners treat Iranian airspace as hazardous even after initial suppression efforts. Iran fields Russian-supplied S-300 systems and claims significant indigenous systems, such as the Bavar 373 family, while also operating a variety of shorter-range and mobile systems associated with Iran's broader integrated air defense effort, and the strategic logic is straightforward. Iran does not need to win air superiority. It needs to prevent the United States from achieving effortless, consequence-free air supremacy, and it especially wants to threaten the high-value enablers, tankers, ISR aircraft, and support platforms that expand U.S. reach and tempo. If those enablers must stand farther off, sortie rates and time on station can drop, and Iran buys time for dispersal. And retaliation. That retaliation core is missiles and drones. Iran's ballistic and cruise missile forces are widely assessed as central to its deterrent posture. in part because Iran cannot modernize its air force at anything like the pace of U.S. partners in the Gulf, so missiles become the instrument for striking bases, ports, energy infrastructure, and regional command centers, and for signaling that any war will not be confined to a small number of Iranian targets. In an actual conflict, Iran would likely attempt a rhythm of launches, some for military effect, some for saturation, some for signaling, while keeping launchers mobile, using decoys, and exploiting underground storage and rugged terrain. Understanding that U.S. intelligence and strike systems would prioritize finding and destroying launchers, drones widen this problem for defenders because they can be produced and fielded in volume, flown on flexible routes, used for reconnaissance, used as loitering munitions, and used in combined attacks meant to stretch radar coverage and interceptor inventories, and Iran has also proliferated drone capabilities to partners, which creates the additional defensive advantage of multiple fronts that are politically and operationally harder for the United States to shut down quickly. Iran's drone program, as documented in specialist analysis, has roots in the Iran-Iraq War era, and has evolved into a toolset that complements missiles and enables proxy and partner forces, and even where exact performance data are uncertain, the strategic utility is clear. Drones are a cost-imposing way to create persistent air and maritime threats, to gather targeting information, and to force an opponent into continuous defensive posture rather than episodic defense. Beyond the physical battlefield, Iran's defense also includes cyber operations and influence activity, which can be used both for direct disruption, especially against poorly secured networks and internet-connected devices, and for strategic messaging, and U.S. government advisories and major analytical reporting describe Iranian state-linked cyber activity as a persistent risk, emphasizing the targeting of vulnerable networks and the use of a broader ecosystem in which hacktivist branding can blur attribution and complicate responses. In wartime conditions, cyber activity becomes more attractive because it can be dialed up or down, routed through cutouts, and aimed at psychological effect, shaping perceptions of insecurity, causing localized outages, and forcing defenders to divert attention without necessarily triggering the same immediate escalatory dynamics as kinetic attacks, though it also carries its own escalation risks. The other defining pillar of Iran's defense is what many analysts call its network of regional non-state partners and aligned militias, often framed as an axis of resistance, which functions as strategic depth. If Iran itself is struck, Tehran can encourage or enable attacks on U.S. forces and facilities across the region, especially where militia groups have local presence, threaten maritime corridors through partners, including pressure on shipping lanes, and create dilemmas for U.S. partners who fear becoming primary battlegrounds. This is not a guarantee of unified, centrally controlled action. Local politics, national interests, and each group's risk tolerance matter, but it is a way to ensure that escalation is geographically distributed and politically complicated, particularly if U.S. forces rely on regional basing, overflight, and logistics. Even when Gulf governments seek to avoid war and lobby against escalation, the mere possibility of retaliation against bases and infrastructure can constrain operational choices and influence diplomatic pressure. The net effect is that Iran's defense is a campaign design, not a single operation. 1. Absorb and survive the first wave by dispersal, redundancy, and underground protection. 2. Retaliate quickly enough to demonstrate resolve and impose immediate costs, often through missiles, drones, and proxy attacks. 3. Keep the maritime and regional economic environment unstable enough that global actors pressure for de-escalation. 4. Keep enough capabilities intact, especially mobile launchers, drones, and decentralized proxy options, to make repeated U.S. strike rounds politically and materially expensive. And 5. Use diplomacy and information operations to split coalitions, portray U.S. action as destabilizing, and encourage third parties to push for ceasefire frameworks. At the same time, any full analysis must be honest about constraints and vulnerabilities, because truth matters more than bravado. The United States has overwhelming advantages in ISR, stealth strike, electronic warfare, undersea warfare, and precision targeting. U.S. and allied missile defenses can reduce the effectiveness of Iranian salvos. Sustained strikes could degrade Iranian command nodes, radars, air defenses, and fixed infrastructure, and an overt attempt by Iran to completely close Hormuz indefinitely would also threaten Iran's own economic lifelines and could strengthen international support for coercive measures against Tehran. Moreover, history shows that predicting exact escalation pathways is difficult. Analysts lay out multiple scenarios from limited strikes and symbolic responses to wider regional war, and even when Iran intends calibrated signaling, miscalculation can occur, a strike causing unexpected casualties, a successful attack on a high-value target, or local actors escalating beyond what Tehran prefers, which can trigger U.S. escalation and broaden the target set from narrow military sites to missile production, command leadership, and regime security organs. Therefore, the most realistic picture of how Iran would defend itself is not Iran wins or Iran collapses, but a grim contest of endurance. And risk management, in which Iran tries to keep enough launch capacity, enough maritime threat, enough cyber nuisance or disruption, and enough proxy pressure alive to make the war politically unsustainable for its adversary, while the United States tries to use speed, precision, and overwhelming force to suppress those threats faster than they can be regenerated, and tries to keep regional partners aligned and global economic damage contained. If war begins, Iran's defensive success would be measured less by territory held and more by whether it can preserve regime continuity, maintain retaliatory credibility, and compel negotiation before its strategic assets are attrited beyond recovery, and U.S. success would be measured less by how many targets are struck and more by whether Iranian retaliation is contained, shipping and energy markets are stabilized, and Iran's ability to regenerate missile drone pressure and proxy attacks is durably reduced, outcomes that are not guaranteed even with U.S. military superiority, because Iran's entire defensive architecture is built to trade space and infrastructure for time, ambiguity, dispersion, and multi-front pressure.